Welcome to Unit 6 of this video training, and this will be our last unit. In the last section, we talked about supervision basics. In this unit, we'll talk about preventative supervision, or how to avoid the potholes. By being aware of areas that can become those potholes in advance, we can often avoid the types of issues that can cause problems for the CPS, the supervisor, the team, and beyond. One way to avoid potholes is to address staff concerns as early in the process as possible. It's important that all staff feel valued in their work, not just CPSs. And as humans, we all get apprehensive about change. While each individual may have his or her own concerns, studies have shown that there are some particular concerns that are frequently voiced by staff. Davidson and his colleagues have been investigating peer roles and integration efforts for a number of years. In a recent article, they outlined the greatest concerns identified by staff when peer workers were being introduced into a traditional mental health setting. People surveyed were concerned that peer specialists were too fragile to meet the demands of the job, were unable to perform necessary administrative tasks, didn't or couldn't understand proper boundaries related to being a worker in the mental health system, and generally feared that bringing in peer workers would add to and not lessen their work burden. Let's take a look at each of these, because as a supervisor, your awareness of these concerns can help you to address them in advance. Be sensitive to their presence once a peer worker is being supervised by you, or address ways in which the supervisee's work performance may be fanning the flames of these fears. The idea that CPSs are too fragile comes from a lack of knowledge or belief about recovery, and assumes that people are coming into CPS jobs right as they're leaving treatment, hospital, residential settings, whatever. It goes back to the view of CPS work being part of a person's own vocational rehabilitation, where the agency is providing a service to the person rather than seeing the person as a worker who is contributing to the agency and expected to meet the same employment requirements as other staff. It also discounts the stress related to living with a disability and all that it entails: poverty, marginalization, lack of valued identity, etc. While working may present stress for all of us, those of us who have experienced living with a mental health diagnosis often find the stress of work a welcomed and positive stress in our lives, rather than something negative. Finally, it discounts the work that CPSs have done in their personal lives to override the, quote, chronic and forever illness models that still plague our mental health systems. Take, for example, a tagline I read just the other day referring to work that's being done in one of our agencies. It said, quote, helping people to live meaningful lives despite having severe and persistent mental illness. You can image an ongoing daily struggle between the person's efforts to live and the severe and persistent mental illness waiting in the wings to pounce. CPSs have found a way, through incredible strength within, to rewrite these scripts, find new ways of seeing themselves in their lives, challenged that conventional wisdom, and fought their way into and beyond these messages. Saying CPSs are too fragile for the job negates the path they have walked to get to the door of the agency. And for many, this has been an incredible journey that is often inspirational to others. At the same time, not everyone who passes the CPS course is necessarily prepared to be an effective worker. Like all certification courses, the CPS imparts knowledge and some skill, but can't begin to cover the full gamut of assessment needed to ensure that a CPS applicant is prepared to meet all the needs of a job. And the person may or may not possess good self-assessment skills. This is where hiring and human resources skills of the organization play an equally important role as the training component. Ultimately, it's up to the supervisor to ensure that a CPS gets no more and no less rights, benefits, supports, and expectations than any other employee. Like all employees, CPSs will probably take sick time, and like many other employees, whether stated or not, some of that sick time may be related to mental health issues. CPSs may access the rights under the ADA, as may any other employees with disabilities, etc. A CPS may have times when he or she is praised for their work, and may have times when constructive criticism is more fitting. So long as a CPS is treated the same as other employees, this myth should dissolve. Better yet, if staff understand in advance that the expectation is that CPSs will meet all the same professional requirements of employees, it may eliminate these issues before they even begin. The second concern frequently cited by staff is related to the administrative functions of the job. Staff list a CPS's lack of work and educational backgrounds as some of the reasons for this concern. While it's true that many CPSs might not have worked in a long time, and many have not had the educational advantages of other staff, few CPSs are able to pass the exam without the ability to read and write in English. The more important question, and the one that we're still grappling with as CPSs are coming into the workforce, is how much documentation is fitting for the role. Every time a CPS writes a note on someone, the mutuality of the position is eroded. At the same time, a certain amount of documentation is necessary to have the position funded. Hopefully, as more peer roles are developed, we will find creative ways to meet the funding requirements of documentation while minimizing the amount of personal disclosure included in the notes. It is especially important that CPSs are not required to use clinical language that sets up a power differential, is often used erroneously, and can be pejorative and judgmental. The mutuality of the role is strengthened by everyday language, or, quote, human experience language, as it's taught in the CPS class. Another area of concern is in the area of confidentiality and information sharing. Should CPSs be able to see files? Will they abide by confidentiality rules, given how small the community is, etc.? These are some of the questions that often arise. Peer staff, like all other employees, are expected to conform to policies and regulations regarding confidentiality and privacy. In addition, the Code of Ethics for CPSs also requires them to keep people's information confidential. Training and supervision support this, and peer staff are employees who are just as responsible as any other staff for keeping information private. There is no reason to believe that this will be any more difficult for peer staff than for anyone else. In fact, says Davidson, given the sensitivity peer staff have to privacy issues based on their own experiences as a service user, it is more likely that they will guard the client's confidentiality even more so than non-peer staff. Another area of concern, and one that I hear about constantly, is the area of boundaries and dual relationships. In the CPS program, we don't talk about boundaries per se. That's a clinical term, and we stay away from clinical language. But we do talk about negotiating complex relationships. The unique position of peer workers as once being service users, but not that now, and now being staff, but in some ways not really, leads to a complexity all of its own in terms of all the relationships that a peer specialist has to navigate in their work. There are no clear inside and outside lines, but many shades of gray. Beyond the complexity of role definition, we also know that the recovery community is small, and avoiding dual relationships is a near impossibility. Nor do we believe the rule is ever that black and white. Even when codes of ethics say no dual relationships, the reality is that there are dual relationships all the time. So the CPS Code of Ethics addresses and provides guidance within the realities of the community, while also staying mindful to the values and principles that must underlie how we negotiate complex relationships. The CPS Code of Ethics provide clear guidance around issues such as sexual and intimate relationships and receiving gifts that mirrors most ethical codes in the human services field. But with dual relationships, CPSs are required to think carefully about the implications of any dual relationship and avoid them whenever they can potentially be harmful to someone who is or has received services from the CPS. Instead of a prohibition where people spend their time deciding if something is or isn't a dual relationship, CPSs are given the responsibility of evaluating all double type of relationships to see if they might have any harmful effect, rather than if they qualify as a dual relationship under the code. So the emphasis is on, is there any possible harm that can come from this relationship? The other boundary issue that's often raised is around disclosure of personal lived experience. I often hear comments like, CPSs don't have good boundaries, suggesting that they're sharing too much information with people that they're working with. Acceptable levels of disclosure vary across disciplines and are always put into the framework of therapeutic sharing. Therapeutic sharing is determined in part by the relationship between the provider and the person using services. For example, a social worker, a psychiatrist, and a direct service provider would have different considerations in the decision of what was therapeutic sharing. The second factor, and this applies for everyone, is that it should always benefit the person receiving services and not be a therapeutic tool for the person disclosing. It is important to remember that CPS practice is built around the art of disclosure. That is the primary tool that a CPS brings with them, sharing the lived experience of the who, what, when, where, and how of the recovery journey. A large part of the CPS training deals with when and how to tell pieces or snippets of your recovery experience, including key questions to keep in mind. Who is my audience? What is the purpose of my sharing right now? Is it something that can benefit the person I'm working with? And will it pose any risk to that person or to myself? So within those parameters, CPSs, unlike staff who have received clinical training, should be sharing on a regular basis and to do so is not a matter of having bad boundaries, but merely working within the practice of certified peer specialists. The final area that arises is around the workload. And the concern that bringing on CPSs will just add to the workload when people are already feeling stretched to the max. This belief is often related to the misunderstanding about CPS work and thinking that staff will now have to train these new mini clinicians how to take on different work. But of course, if the CPS role is understood, then people will know that they come with a set of skills and competencies to perform their own separate and distinctive job. Once the person is fully acclimated to the organization, he or she should be able to perform the work independently and in a way that complements the work that others are doing, not hindering their work. So attending to any of these staff concerns up front, before misinformation gets into the fabric of how people look at and evaluate the peer workforce, can alleviate many of the potholes that may come up in the road. Perhaps one of the most problematic areas in supervision of CPSs by clinical staff involves the issue of role confusion. We all have multiple roles that we play in our lives. We're mothers or fathers, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, caretakers, and colleagues. The problems arise when we forget which role we're in at the moment and slip into a different role that isn't fitting for the time or the relationship. Acting like a brother to a person receiving services isn't fitting, nor is being the doctor or lawyer for your own family members. Most of us can keep our roles straight and are usually helped by the context or environment we're in. We know that when we're in work, our colleagues' selves dictate our behavior with coworkers, and our understanding of our professional care dictates how we interact with people using services. When we're at home, our spouse and parent hats go on. And when we go to a hockey game with friends, we hopefully leave our clinical hat at home. However, when the prerequisite for becoming a peer worker is having a psychiatric diagnosis and background of treatment in the mental health system, the lines become blurred between colleague and person using services. Even when we are consciously keeping ourselves mindful that this is a worker and colleague, the subconscious may still be reacting to the person in the former role that is more familiar. So, for example, if a peer worker expresses anger or frustration about something occurring in the work setting, other staff may become concerned about the person's displayed, quote, agitation. That is, seeing it through the lens of illness and symptoms rather than within the context of the situation as it is. The question becomes, can you, the supervisor, really see the CPS as an employee and a valued worker, or will the image of him or her as really being a, quote, pig in lion's clothing rest just below the surface, distorting your vision? This is the challenge that exists. Probably the best analogy for what we're talking about is that of cross-cultural competence. Whenever we think of embracing diversity, the first step is to look within, not without. It's to explore, as an objective observer, what biases, beliefs, and myths we have developed over time so we can challenge them when they arise. As humans, we will have biases. There's no way around it. But as humans who are lifelong learners, We figure out what those biases are, be aware of them, and when they pop their nasty little heads up, we correct our thinking and don't act on them. As we think about supervising CPSs, it's much the same process for both the supervisor and the CPS. Yes, role confusion can go the other way too. A CPS may have biases against providers from his or her own experiences, or may still look to their supervisor as an ongoing provider or supporter in their life. If you sense that this is happening, it's important to raise it in supervision and help your employee to think through what issues are fitting for the workplace and which issues are better resolved by other supports, hopefully in the community. If the agency has an EAP service, you can also suggest that the CPS utilize this service the same as any other employee. So given the realities of role confusion on both sides, what can we do to minimize at least? Well, the first thing is to go back to our job descriptions. Focusing on work performance rather than personal issues helps both parties to keep the roles clear. When your employee is emotional about work, as can happen to any of us, offer empathy, but also solution-focused support related to work tasks rather than slipping into the role of therapist. Support self-determination rather than fostering unreinforcing helplessness. This means supporting the person to make good decisions, as well as talking openly about areas that are strengths, as well as those areas that need strengthening. As a supervisor, this is one of your key roles, and it is something that can only benefit the person. If the person appears to have issues or needs that aren't specifically work-based, they should be supported to access resources in the community, not within the provider agency, and especially not from you. And most important, and this you see is a theme that keeps coming up, is to not step into that caretaker role, but instead treat the supervisee like a competent adult at all times, even if he or she is demonstrating or describing being in distress at work. This is the most challenging of all, mainly because our inclination to go there is rooted in genuine caring, just like the mental health system that we're trying to change. At first, stepping out of our roles in a supervisory relationship may seem so subtle that we don't even see it happening. But then, when things are stressful, the old roles just automatically click in and we go on autopilot, thinking, saying, and doing things that clearly represent provider-service user relationships rather than colleague relationships. And we find ourselves back at that place being reminded that help is not help if it doesn't help. When we fall back into the provider service user role, it doesn't help the person, doesn't help the supervisor or the agency, it doesn't help people getting services or the CPS profession. Here's a review table of the points we just reviewed. There's also a Quizlet, that's a mini quiz, attached as exercise 6 that walks you through some scenarios and gives you the opportunity of working these out with the CPSs you supervise as well. There's also a role clarity checklist that you can use for your agency the department and team, and for you, the supervisor. Hopefully, this will give you some anchors to use, especially if you sense that the lines are becoming blurred. Every possible pothole can't be anticipated in advance, but hopefully attending to these known areas can smooth out the road for you. And with that, we come to the end of our training. We've covered a lot of ground, talked about a lot of topics, and you've been asked to do quite a number of exercises and readings along the way. Even though, in some ways, it's just the tip of the iceberg, what we've covered and all the hard work you put into this course should lead you down the road to meaningful, effective, and fulfilling supervising with your CPS and for you. In many ways, we're in a different mental health system and moving towards a new future. While at the same time, there are some basics that live on, one being the power of a great supervisor. I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for the supervisors I've had and all the support they offered me. It was having supervisors that treated me and met me as a competent, learning, growing, adult professional woman. Supervisors that supported me as I went from volunteer to part-time and then full-time work, school where I got my master's degree, and then my CPS, and finally where I've worked for the past 5 years, directing the CPS program and providing training throughout this state and the country on integrating peers into the mental health workforce. I've had the fortune to have supervisors who cared about me but didn't take care of me. They held the bar up, but they supported me and encouraged me to reach up for that bar. Supervision can make or break one's professional life. And I hope that what you've gotten from these lessons over these past 6 units will help you as you support and encourage and help the professional growth of the CPSs you'll be supervising. I thank you for all the hard work that you've done in this course. I hope it serves you well. I hope it's helpful. And I wish you the very best in your supervision with the CPSs of today and tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.